Everyone in the ballroom expected the dare to end with laughter, but before the night was over, a single unexpected choice would change the fate of the most powerful man in the city and the woman everyone had spent years pretending not to see. The chandeliers above the Castellano estate scattered warm light across polished marble floors while a string quartet drifted through the air, filling every corner of the mansion with effortless elegance. Politicians, business leaders, celebrities, and old family friends moved from conversation to conversation with crystal glasses in their hands, each person hoping to earn a few precious minutes of Dominic Castellano's attention. At 36 years old, Dominic had built a reputation that stretched far beyond New York. He rarely raised his voice. He never wasted words. When he entered a room, conversations naturally softened, not because anyone feared shouting, but because everyone wanted to hear what he might say next. Tonight he stood near the grand fireplace in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, listening politely as investors discussed another luxury hotel project, though his calm blue eyes quietly observed everything around him. Across the ballroom, almost invisible among the catering staff, Amara Johnson carefully balanced a silver tray filled with sparkling water. She had worked at the estate for nearly 8 months, arriving before sunrise and leaving long after midnight whenever large events filled the calendar. She knew which guests preferred lemon, which children secretly wanted extra dessert, and which elderly visitors needed someone to quietly pull out a chair before they asked. Most people never remembered her name. Some barely acknowledged her existence. Others looked at her plus-sized figure with amused smiles before quickly looking away. Amara had learned years ago that kindness required less energy than resentment, so she simply smiled and kept working. As she crossed the ballroom, a small group of wealthy young guests gathered near the champagne tower began laughing louder than everyone else. One of them glanced toward Amara before whispering something that made the others grin. She recognized that look immediately. It was the same expression she had seen since middle school, the one that arrived moments before someone decided she would become the evening's entertainment. She continued walking, hoping to pass unnoticed, but one woman stepped into her path with an exaggerated smile. "Come on," the guest said playfully. "We're all playing truth or dare. Don't be shy." Amara politely shook her head. "Thank you, but I'm working." Another guest laughed. "Exactly why it'll be fun." A circle slowly formed, curiosity spreading through nearby conversations. Cameras remained tucked away, but dozens of eyes drifted toward the unexpected interruption. Amara could already feel warmth rising in her cheeks. She had no interest in becoming part of the party. She simply wanted to finish her shift and return to her apartment before midnight. "Just one dare," someone insisted. "Then we'll leave you alone." She hesitated for only a second. Experience had taught her that refusing often invited even more attention. "Fine," she answered softly. "One dare." The tallest guest exchanged mischievous glances with his friends before pointing toward Dominic, who still stood across the ballroom speaking with distinguished guests beneath the glow of the enormous crystal chandelier. A ripple of anticipation swept through the crowd. "Walk over there," he announced with a grin, "and give Mr. Castellano a quick kiss on the cheek." Laughter immediately erupted around the circle. Several people shook their heads, already certain she would refuse. Others waited for her to apologize and disappear. Amara looked across the room toward the man everyone admired from a distance. She knew almost nothing about Dominic except that he treated employees with quiet professionalism and always thanked the kitchen staff after every event. Taking one slow breath, she carefully placed her serving tray onto a nearby table, straightened her uniform, and began walking across the marble floor. Every step seemed louder than the music. Conversations gradually faded until only the quartet continued playing. Dominic noticed her approaching and politely excused himself from the conversation without the slightest hint of annoyance. Amara stopped a respectful distance away, her hands folded nervously in front of her. "Mr. Castellano," she said gently, "I'm very sorry. Someone dared me to do something foolish." For the first time that evening, Dominic smiled with genuine curiosity. "Then perhaps we should help them learn what courage looks like." Before doubt could stop her, Amara leaned forward and placed the briefest, most respectful kiss on his cheek. The ballroom froze. Even the musicians seemed uncertain whether to continue playing. Amara immediately stepped back, ready to apologize and return to work, But Dominic never looked embarrassed or offended. Instead, he calmly met the astonished faces surrounding them before speaking with quiet confidence that carried effortlessly through the silent room. "From this moment forward," he said, never taking his eyes off Amara, "she will be treated with the same respect you offer me." No one moved for several long seconds because no one knew whether they had just witnessed a joke or a decision that would ripple through every corner of the Castellano estate. The silence settled over the ballroom like fresh snow until Dominic slowly turned toward the group of laughing guests who had started the dare. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable, yet the confidence in his posture made every smile begin to disappear. He did not raise his voice. He did not embarrass anyone. Instead, he spoke with the same steady composure that had earned respect from people who spent their lives competing for influence. "Kindness should never become entertainment," he said, "especially when it is directed at someone who has done nothing except work with honesty." The words landed far heavier than anger ever could. Several guests lowered their eyes toward their glasses while others quietly stepped backward, suddenly wishing they had remained across the room. Amara stood frozen beside him, convinced she had just created the biggest mistake of her life. She opened her mouth to apologize again, but Dominic gently lifted one hand, signaling there was nothing more she needed to say. "Please return to your responsibilities," he told her with a reassuring nod. "And do not allow tonight to trouble your heart." His tone carried no trace of embarrassment, only simple respect. Amara whispered a quiet thank you before retrieving her silver tray with slightly trembling hands. As she continued serving drinks, something unusual began happening throughout the ballroom. Guests who had ignored her all evening suddenly greeted her politely. A woman who had walked past her countless times offered a warm smile. An elderly judge thanked her by name after reading it from the small badge pinned to her uniform. Even the musicians exchanged gentle smiles as she passed their stage. None of it felt natural. It felt as though one sentence from Dominic had quietly rewritten the invisible rules of the room. Near the entrance, the estate manager, Eleanor Brooks, watched everything with narrowed eyes. She had supervised hundreds of formal events over the past 15 years and believed every employee should remain unnoticed. She approached Dominic after the crowd slowly returned to their conversations. "Sir," she said carefully, "people may misunderstand your statement." Dominic accepted a glass of sparkling water without looking away from the ballroom. "Only those who misunderstand respect," he replied calmly. Eleanor hesitated before asking another question. "Should I transfer Miss Johnson to another property after tonight?" Dominic looked directly at her for the first time. "No, she remains exactly where she is. She has earned her place here through hard work, not through anyone else's opinion." Across the room, Amara could feel dozens of curious eyes following her every movement. She wished she could disappear into the kitchen where stainless steel counters and the comforting smell of fresh bread always felt safer than crystal chandeliers and expensive tuxedos. Every smile directed toward her now felt unfamiliar. Every whisper made her wonder whether people were laughing again. As she entered the service hallway carrying empty glasses, one of the younger servers hurried beside her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Amara forced a small smile. "I think so. I just want a night to be over." Before he could answer, the head chef stepped through the swinging kitchen doors with an order sheet in one hand. "Miss Johnson," he called. "Mr. Castellano has requested that the staff enjoy dessert before going home." Every member of the team. The kitchen suddenly fell silent. It had become a tradition for Dominic to thank his employees after major events, but tonight the gesture felt different. It felt personal. Amara looked back toward the glowing ballroom, where Dominic continued greeting distinguished guests as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet somewhere deep inside, she sensed that the simple life she had carefully built around remaining unnoticed had quietly come to an end, and she had no idea what tomorrow morning would bring. Morning arrived wrapped in soft autumn sunlight, but inside the Castellano estate nothing felt ordinary anymore. The mansion awakened with its familiar rhythm of polished silver, fresh flowers, warm pastries, and carefully scheduled meetings, yet every whispered conversation eventually circled back to one name: Amara Johnson. Housekeepers exchanged uncertain glances while arranging guest suites. Gardeners paused their work long enough to discuss what they had heard from the kitchen. Drivers repeated different versions of the previous evening until no two stories sounded exactly alike. Some believed Mr. Castellano had simply defended an employee from public embarrassment. Others insisted they had witnessed the beginning of something far more unusual. Amara wished every rumor would disappear before breakfast. She quietly tied on her apron, gathered fresh towels, and followed the cleaning schedule exactly as she had every day for the past 8 months. Routine had always been her safest place. If she focused on folding linens with perfect corners and dusting bookshelves until every surface reflected the morning light, perhaps everyone would eventually forget what happened. Unfortunately, the mansion had an excellent memory. As she entered the east hallway carrying a basket of freshly pressed towels, 2 junior staff members immediately stopped talking. They smiled politely, but the awkward silence that followed felt heavier than any insult she had ever heard. Amara simply smiled back and continued walking. She refused to become angry with people whose curiosity she understood. Even she still struggled to understand the previous night herself. Near the library, Eleanor Brooks waited with a leather folder pressed against her side. Her posture remained flawless as always, but the expression on her face revealed quiet frustration. "Miss Johnson," she said in her usual professional tone, "Mr. Castellano wishes for you to continue your regular responsibilities today." Amara nodded quickly. "Of course." Eleanor studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "I would recommend avoiding unnecessary conversations. Attention fades much faster when it is not encouraged." "I never wanted attention," Amara answered honestly. Eleanor looked at her as though weighing whether to believe those words. Finally, she gave a small nod and walked away without another sentence. Amara released a slow breath she had not realized she had been holding. A few minutes later, she entered the mansion library, one of her favorite rooms because it was usually empty during the morning. Tall windows overlooked colorful maple trees, while thousands of leather-bound books filled shelves stretching nearly 20 feet toward the painted ceiling. She always loved the peaceful silence there. As she carefully dusted the lower shelves, she noticed a hardcover book resting on a reading table beside a porcelain cup of untouched coffee. It had clearly been left behind during an early meeting. She gently picked it up, straightened the ribbon bookmark that had slipped between the pages, and returned it to its proper shelf without a second thought. Most people would have left it where it was. Dominic's calm voice echoed from the opposite side of the room. Amara nearly dropped the feather duster before turning toward him. He stood near the window wearing a navy blue suit without a jacket, morning sunlight outlining his broad shoulders. He had apparently been reading quietly the entire time. "I did not realize anyone was here," she admitted softly. Dominic closed the book he had been holding. "You always organize what others overlook." Amara looked down, uncertain how to answer. "It is just part of the job." Dominic slowly shook his head. "No, it is part of your character." The compliment unsettled her more than criticism ever could. Before she could respond, his executive assistant appeared in the doorway carrying a tablet. "Sir, your board meeting begins in 5 minutes." Dominic nodded without taking his eyes off Amara. "Thank you." As he walked toward the exit, he paused beside her just long enough to say one quiet sentence. "Do not spend today worrying about how strangers see you. The people who matter usually notice different things." He continued down the hallway before she could reply. Amara remained standing among the rows of books, holding the feather duster against her chest while his words settled deep inside her heart. For the first time in many years, someone had spoken to her as though her value had never depended on the reflection she saw in a mirror. The rest of the week unfolded with quiet precision, yet something invisible had shifted inside the Castellano estate. Every room remained immaculate. Every meeting began exactly on schedule. Every employee completed their duties with practiced excellence. But Amara could no longer escape the feeling that unseen eyes followed her wherever she went. She responded the only way she knew how. She worked harder. Before sunrise, she arranged fresh flowers in the front hall, replacing every bouquet before the first guests arrived. She polished antique mirrors until they reflected the morning light like still water. She carried laundry baskets up 3 flights of stairs without complaint, smiling politely at everyone she passed. She hoped diligence would erase curiosity. Instead, it seemed to deepen it. During her afternoon break, she slipped outside to the estate's quiet garden, carrying nothing more than a paper cup of coffee. The crisp October air smelled of cedar and fallen leaves, reminding her of afternoons long before she had ever stepped inside a mansion. She sat alone on a wooden bench beneath a large maple tree whose bright red leaves drifted gently onto the stone pathway. Solitude had always been her safest companion. As she watched a squirrel dart across the lawn, memories surfaced without invitation. She remembered being 12 years old, standing in a department store dressing room, while classmates laughed because none of the dresses came in her size. She remembered pretending not to hear strangers offer unsolicited advice about losing weight before they even learned her name. She remembered hearing people describe beauty as though it belonged only to certain bodies, certain skin tones, certain faces. Every birthday had quietly taught her the same lesson. Smile first. Speak softly. Do not expect to be noticed unless someone needs help carrying something heavy. Over time, she stopped wondering whether she was beautiful. She simply hoped to become useful. That hope had carried her through community college, through part-time jobs, through caring for her grandmother until the very end, and eventually to the Castellano estate. Helping others felt easier than asking anyone to truly see her. A gentle breeze stirred the branches above her, carrying another crimson leaf onto her lap. She smiled faintly before brushing it away. You always choose the quietest place. Dominic's familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up in surprise to find him walking alone through the garden without security or assistance. He held a simple ceramic mug instead of the expensive crystal glasses usually placed before him during business meetings. There was something unexpectedly ordinary about the moment. Embarrassed, Amara quickly stood. I am sorry, sir. I did not realize this area was reserved. Dominic shook his head with a relaxed smile. It is a garden. It belongs to anyone who needs a moment to breathe. They stood together in comfortable silence while wind carried leaves across the path. Finally, Dominic glanced toward the colorful trees. You spend a great deal of time making life easier for other people. Amara lowered her eyes. That is my job. No, he answered gently. That is your instinct. She looked at him with quiet confusion. No one had ever described her that way before. Dominic continued watching the leaves drift through the afternoon sunlight. People often mistake kindness for weakness because they have never learned how much strength it requires. Amara felt something tighten inside her chest. For years, she had measured herself through the careless opinions of strangers. Yet standing there beneath the maple tree, listening to a man admired by everyone around him speak with such calm certainty, she realized he had never once commented on her appearance. Not her size, not her clothes, not the features she had spent years wishing she could change. He had noticed only the choices she made when no one expected applause. And for the first time in a very long while, Amara wondered whether the parts of herself she had spent years trying to hide might actually be the parts most worth seeing. Days passed with surprising calm, yet Dominic found himself noticing details that had once blended into the background of his own home. He noticed that every vase in the mansion somehow remained perfectly arranged without anyone ever seeing who replaced the flowers. He noticed that elderly visitors always seemed to receive the most comfortable chairs before they realized they needed to sit. He noticed that anxious new employees relaxed after only a few minutes of speaking with Amara, even though she never tried to become the center of attention. It was as though kindness followed her quietly from room to room, leaving no signature except the comfort people felt after she had gone. One rainy Thursday afternoon, the estate prepared for another private gathering. Delivery trucks lined the circular driveway while staff hurried through long hallways carrying decorations, fresh linens, and catering supplies. Dominic reviewed financial reports inside his study when he happened to glance through the tall window overlooking the service entrance. Below, one of the young kitchen assistants struggled to carry several heavy grocery boxes across the wet stone walkway. Before anyone called for help, Amara appeared from beneath the covered entrance carrying an umbrella in one hand. She did not take over the work. Instead, she divided the boxes into smaller loads, laughed softly at something the embarrassed assistant said, and walked beside him through the rain so neither of them became soaked. They disappeared inside smiling. Dominic watched for another moment before quietly returning to his paperwork, but he found himself reading the same paragraph 3 times without remembering a single word. Later that afternoon, he crossed the kitchen on his way to meet a supplier. Most executives would have used the formal entrance, but Dominic preferred seeing how daily operations actually functioned. The kitchen bustled with activity as chefs prepared sauces, bakers arranged fresh bread, and servers polished silverware until every piece reflected the overhead lights. Near one corner, an older dishwasher rubbed his wrist with a tired expression while trying to lift a large tray. Without hesitation, Amara stepped beside him, took the heavier side herself, and continued talking about his granddaughter's upcoming piano recital as though helping him required no recognition at all. The older man smiled with visible relief. Dominic kept walking without interrupting them. Yet another quiet observation settled into his thoughts. She never performed kindness when someone important was watching. She simply never stopped doing it. That evening, the mansion welcomed several charitable foundation directors for dinner. As conversations filled the dining room, a small boy visiting with his grandparents accidentally dropped a plate of cookies onto the polished hardwood floor. The sudden crash echoed across the room. The child immediately looked frightened, expecting disappointment. Before anyone else reacted, Amara knelt beside him with a gentle smile. "Looks like the cookies wanted to explore the floor first," she said warmly. The boy laughed through his embarrassment. Together, they carefully gathered the unbroken cookies while another server swept away the crumbs. Moments later, the child returned to his family smiling instead of crying. Dominic observed the exchange from across the room. No speeches, no dramatic gestures, just another quiet moment that restored someone's dignity before fear could take its place. As the evening came to an end and the final guests departed, Dominic remained alone in the grand foyer, watching employees finish their responsibilities. Marble floors reflected the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, while soft piano music drifted from hidden speakers. His longtime advisor, Victor Hale, approached carrying tomorrow's schedule. "You have been unusually distracted this week," Victor said with a knowing smile. Dominic accepted the folder but continued watching Amara thank every member of the cleaning crew before leaving for the night. "No," he answered thoughtfully. "I believe I have simply been paying attention to the right things for the first time in a very long while." The peaceful rhythm of the estate continued for another week until subtle changes began appearing around the edges of ordinary life, so small that most people dismissed them as coincidence. A delivery truck arrived 2 hours earlier than scheduled without explanation. An unfamiliar florist asked unusual questions about employee routines before quietly leaving without making a purchase. A luxury sedan remained parked across the street from the main gate for 3 consecutive mornings before disappearing each afternoon. None of those moments seemed important by themselves, yet Dominic had built his success by noticing patterns other people ignored. During a breakfast meeting in his private study, Victor Hale quietly placed several photographs on the polished walnut desk. "Our security team believes someone has been observing the estate," he said carefully. Dominic studied the images without changing his expression. Most showed nothing more than ordinary traffic and delivery vehicles, but one photograph caught his attention. It showed the front entrance just after sunrise. Amara was helping an elderly florist carry several flower boxes inside, while smiling as though she had known him for years. Standing several yards away, a stranger appeared to be watching the interaction instead of the building itself. Dominic looked up. "Has anyone identified him?" Victor slowly shook his head. "Not yet. We believe he has no interest in the property. We believe he is watching someone who works here." Dominic's eyes returned to the photograph. He remained silent for several seconds before gathering the pictures into a neat stack. "Increase security around the staff without alarming them," he instructed calmly, "especially during arrival and departure." Victor nodded, recognizing the unusual weight behind those simple words. Later that afternoon, Amara finished organizing fresh linens in the West Wing before leaving through the employee entrance with several coworkers. She laughed quietly as one of the gardeners complained about losing every fantasy football prediction that season, and for a few peaceful moments, she forgot the whispers that had surrounded her since the gala. She declined a ride home, as she usually did, choosing instead to enjoy the crisp autumn air during the short walk to the nearby subway station. Halfway down the tree-lined sidewalk, she noticed a little girl struggling to keep hold of colorful school papers while strong wind scattered them across the pavement. Without hesitation, Amara hurried forward, gathering every page before they reached the busy intersection. The grateful mother thanked her repeatedly, while the child proudly hugged the papers against her chest. Amara smiled, wished them a wonderful afternoon, and continued toward the station completely unaware that two discreet security professionals observed the entire exchange from a respectful distance. That evening, Dominic received a brief update before dinner. Miss Johnson arrived home safely, one member of the security team reported. Dominic acknowledged the information with a quiet nod before dismissing everyone else from the room. Left alone beneath the warm glow of the library lamps, he found himself standing beside the tall windows overlooking the estate grounds. He had told himself many times that his concern came from responsibility alone. She worked in his home. She deserved protection just as every employee did. Yet the explanation no longer satisfied even his own conscience. He was not asking about every employee. He was asking about one. The realization settled quietly into his heart, not with excitement, but with undeniable clarity. The following morning, Amara arrived at work to discover a small change she could not explain. Additional security personnel greeted every staff member with polite smiles. New outdoor lights had been installed along the employee walkway overnight, and transportation was being offered to anyone finishing late evening shifts. No announcement accompanied the changes. No one mentioned her name. Still, as she looked across the courtyard and noticed Dominic speaking quietly with Victor before glancing in her direction for only a brief moment, she sensed that someone had made a thoughtful decision without expecting gratitude, and somewhere beyond the peaceful walls of the estate, unseen eyes had already begun testing the quiet strength of a kindness neither of them fully understood. The following week brought clear skies and cool mornings, yet an uneasy feeling lingered beneath the peaceful routine of the estate. Nothing appeared out of place to the casual observer, but Dominic noticed that Victor checked security reports more often than usual, and that the staff quietly began leaving the property in small groups instead of walking home alone. Amara assumed management was simply being extra careful after hosting several high-profile events. She appreciated the thoughtfulness, but never imagined any of it had anything to do with her. One Friday afternoon, after finishing the final guest suites, she decided to stop by a neighborhood community center before heading home. Every month, she volunteered an hour helping children organize donated books for the small reading room. It was something she had done long before working at the estate, and she never mentioned it because she believed kindness lost something when it became a story people repeated. The children greeted her with joyful excitement, asking her to read their favorite picture books while they sorted colorful shelves by hand. Their laughter filled the room, bright and effortless. Across the street, inside a parked sedan, an unfamiliar man lowered a pair of binoculars and quietly made a phone call. He did not watch the children. He watched Amara. Several blocks away, one of the discreet security professionals assigned to monitor the area noticed the vehicle had remained in the same parking space for nearly an hour. Without creating alarm, he documented the license plate and contacted Victor. Within minutes, the information reached Dominic during an afternoon planning session. Dominic immediately closed the presentation folder in front of him. "Where is Miss Johnson now?" he asked. "At the community center," Victor answered. "She appears completely safe." Dominic stood and looked through the tall office windows toward the Manhattan skyline. "Make sure she stays that way," he said quietly, without disturbing her. The instruction was carried out exactly as requested. No dramatic confrontation followed. No frightened phone calls interrupted the afternoon. Instead, additional security remained nearby while blending naturally into the neighborhood. Amara finished reading 3 stories, accepted several handmade thank you cards from the children, and began walking toward the subway station with a peaceful smile. She never realized that caring eyes remained only a short distance away. Later that evening, Victor entered Dominic's study carrying another report. "We have confirmed the same individual has appeared near the estate, the subway station, and now the community center." Dominic slowly placed his pen on the desk. "Then this is no coincidence." Victor hesitated before asking the question already forming in both their minds. "Do you believe someone has discovered that she matters to you?" The room became perfectly still. Dominic did not answer immediately because the truth had arrived before he was prepared to speak it aloud. During the past several weeks, he had watched Amara comfort frightened children, encourage exhausted coworkers, respect elderly visitors, and quietly restore dignity wherever she went. Somewhere along the way, Protecting an employee had become protecting one extraordinary person. Finally, he looked at Victor with complete certainty. They cannot discover something that I have only just admitted to myself. Victor remained silent. Dominic continued in the same calm voice that had ended arguments for years. Miss Johnson's safety is now my personal responsibility. At that exact moment, miles away, Amara unlocked the door to her modest apartment and smiled as she placed the children's handmade cards on her small kitchen table. She believed it had been an ordinary Friday filled with simple acts of kindness. She had no idea that someone had quietly begun measuring her importance, or that another man had already decided he would never again allow her to face the world without knowing someone was watching over her with unwavering respect. Saturday arrived wrapped in brilliant sunshine, and the estate welcomed guests for the annual Autumn Charity Luncheon, an event dedicated to supporting neighborhood libraries and children's education programs. Long white tables stretched across the gardens beneath elegant tents, while musicians played soft jazz in the background. Volunteers, donors, teachers, and community leaders mingled together with easy smiles, creating an atmosphere that felt far different from the formal galas usually held at the mansion. Amara spent the morning helping arrange donated books, greeting families, and guiding children toward activity tables where they painted bookmarks and wrote thank you notes to local librarians. She wore the same simple staff uniform she always wore, never imagining anyone would notice her among the dozens of volunteers. Yet, throughout the afternoon, Dominic quietly observed her from across the garden. He watched as she knelt beside a shy little girl who believed her drawing was not good enough to display, gently encouraging her until the child proudly pinned it to the community art wall. He watched her help an elderly volunteer find a comfortable seat before anyone else noticed the woman looked tired. He watched her thank every delivery driver by name after they unloaded supplies. None of those moments lasted longer than a minute, yet together they painted a picture more powerful than any speech delivered from the stage. As the luncheon came to an end, dark clouds unexpectedly rolled across the sky, and a cool breeze swept through the gardens. Volunteers hurried to secure decorations before the first drops of rain arrived. Amara remained behind to help fold chairs and gather children's artwork so nothing would be damaged. Dominic stepped beneath the same tent just as the rain began tapping softly against the canvas overhead. For a moment, they found themselves alone while everyone else carried boxes toward the mansion. Amara smiled politely. I think the weather wanted to end the event on its own schedule. Dominic smiled back. You stayed to help after everyone else finished. She looked around at the remaining supplies. Someone should. He studied her quietly before speaking again. You always believe someone should. Somehow that someone is almost always you. Amara laughed softly, then looked down at the stack of handmade cards resting in her hands. It is easier to help other people than to think about myself. The honesty of the sentence lingered between them. Dominic stepped closer, not invading her space, only enough for his voice to remain gentle beneath the sound of falling rain. Why? She hesitated for several seconds before answering. Because when people spend enough years telling you that you are too different, too noticeable in the wrong ways, or simply not the person anyone would choose, you eventually stop asking to be chosen. You just try to become useful. Dominic's expression softened with unmistakable sadness. He slowly shook his head. Amara, I need you to hear something. She finally met his eyes. Everyone else may have looked at your reflection first. I never did. The rain continued falling beyond the tent while the gardens grew quiet. Dominic spoke with complete sincerity. They noticed your appearance. I noticed the way people feel safer after speaking with you. They noticed your size. I noticed your patience. They noticed what made you different. I noticed what made you rare. Amara felt tears gather despite her efforts to remain composed. No one had ever described her that way before. Dominic offered her one of the children's handmade bookmarks that had fallen onto the table. Across the front, written in uneven blue crayon, were the words, "Kind people help the world grow." He placed it gently into her hand. I believe that child understood something many adults still have not learned. For the first time in years, Amara looked at herself not through the echoes of old judgments, but through the quiet truth reflected in someone else's unwavering respect, and in that peaceful moment she realized the hardest heart she had ever struggled to change had always been her own. Several weeks later, the grand ballroom of the Castellano estate welcomed another gathering. But But this evening felt remarkably different from the one that had quietly changed 2 lives. The same crystal chandeliers filled the room with warm light. The same polished marble reflected elegant gowns and tailored suits. Many of the same influential guests returned, expecting another flawless evening of conversation and celebration. Yet there was one difference everyone noticed the moment they arrived. Every member of the household staff was greeted by name. Servers received sincere thanks instead of impatient gestures. Housekeepers were acknowledged with warm smiles instead of hurried silence. No written policy had ever announced the change. Respect had simply become part of the culture because one man had decided it would. Amara moved gracefully through the ballroom carrying a tray of sparkling water, but the nervous uncertainty that had once shadowed every step was gone. She no longer lowered her eyes out of habit. She smiled because she genuinely felt welcome. Confidence had not changed the kindness in her heart. It had simply allowed the world to see it more clearly. Throughout the evening, Dominic spoke with business leaders, charitable partners, and longtime family friends. Yet his attention naturally drifted toward the people who kept the estate running every day. He thanked the chefs personally before dinner was served. He congratulated a young groundskeeper on the birth of his first child. He asked an elderly housekeeper about her recovery after knee surgery. Watching him, many guests realized that leadership was measured not by how a person treated the powerful, but by how they treated those from whom they expected nothing in return. As dessert was served, the chairman of one of the city's largest charitable foundations approached Dominic with a smile. "Your staff seems unusually loyal," he observed. Dominic looked across the ballroom just as Amara helped an elderly guest adjust her chair before quietly returning to work. "People remain where they are respected," he answered. Simply, the chairman followed his gaze and nodded with thoughtful understanding. Near the end of the evening, Dominic stepped onto the small stage prepared for the foundation's closing remarks. The room gradually became silent as hundreds of eyes turned toward him. He thanked every donor, volunteer, teacher, and community partner for supporting literacy programs throughout the city. Then, after a brief pause, he looked toward the staff gathered respectfully near the back of the ballroom. "Before tonight ends," he said calmly, "there is one more group that deserves recognition." Every employee looked surprised. Beautiful buildings are remembered because of the people who care for them. Successful events happen because someone quietly arrives before sunrise and stays long after the lights fade. Too often those people are overlooked simply because they serve instead of stand on stage. He extended one hand toward the staff. "Tonight, I would like every member of my team to join us here at the front." A wave of astonished whispers moved through the ballroom as housekeepers, cooks, gardeners, drivers, and servers slowly walked forward together. Amara hesitated until Dominic offered an encouraging smile. She stepped onto the stage beside her coworkers, still unable to believe she belonged there. The audience rose to its feet in spontaneous applause that filled the grand hall with warmth instead of obligation. Many guests looked toward Amara, remembering the woman they had once barely noticed. Now they saw someone whose quiet compassion had transformed not only one man's perspective, but the spirit of an entire household. Dominic did not place her above anyone else. He simply stood beside her as an equal human being deserving of dignity and respect. Amara looked across the standing crowd with grateful eyes, finally understanding that worth had never depended on fitting someone else's definition of beauty. It had always lived inside the choices she made every single day. As the applause echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers, the room seemed to understand a truth that no speech alone could have taught. Kindness had accomplished what status never could. And that night, everyone remembered that appearances may capture attention for a moment, but dignity is what remains in people's hearts forever.